everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of the Addiction Help podcast, where we discuss the latest in news, sports, and entertainment as it pertains to the world of addiction and recovery. I will be your host today, Jess, Jessica Miller. I am the Editorial Director for addictionhelp.com. Our beloved Dan is off this week, so today you guys are just hanging out with me. Thank you for those of you who have been listening so far, and for those of you newcomers, welcome. Stoked to have you. Just a reminder, if you want to stay up to date with all of our podcasts and stuff, subscribe to us on YouTube, or we also are available on Spotify or wherever you're watching it now. Hit that subscribe button. And also, I don't know that we've mentioned this before, but I love reading people's comments and getting feedback. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions, drop a comment below because we do actually look at those. So today, we're going to be talking about, let's see, last week we talked about Trank Dope with Chris Carberg, our founder, one of our founders, and just a really rad dude, honestly. And he and Dan spoke about that, and then Dan and I chatted about festivals and drug use. So that was last week. This week, by the time you guys are listening to it, I guess it is May today. Happy May, everyone. So May is actually Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit and what that means and why that's important. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a share. So it's kind of funny that like Dan is off and it's just me with you guys tonight, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my personal struggles with substance abuse as it relates to grief and addiction. So let's get into it. Let me look at my notes here. So May, like I mentioned, is Mental Health Awareness Month, right? So why does that matter? Like, we're aware of mental health. We know that it exists, right? Like, why do we care? Well, one of the really important things about awareness, like these different months that are, let's bring awareness to this, or let's talk about, this topic. I think last month it was alcohol awareness. And it's more than just like, okay, let's be aware that it exists, right? Like, awareness, essentially, these months are designed to reduce stigma. So you probably have seen this. I've seen it a lot in the mental health community, where we talk about how mental health has been stigmatized a lot over the years. It's gotten a lot better. Even, in my 37 years on this planet, it has really improved. But there's still a really big stigma for a lot of people about like mental health in general. Everything from, having a rough day, or like I would call it like a bad brain day, all the way to actually having a diagnosed mental illness or mental health condition. So like me, for example, I have generalized anxiety disorder. I was diagnosed back in like 2014, I think. And I'm super open about it because to me, it's no different. Having a mental illness is no different than having like diabetes or some other kind of illness. Certainly there are different challenges that come with it, of course, but what kind of goes back to the importance of May bringing awareness to it is it allows people to talk about these things, like growing up in the 90s, because I'm old, growing up in the 90s, like we didn't talk about mental health in the way that we do now. Like there was no Mental Health Awareness Month or anything like that. Like, I remember when I was a kid, like in 11, 12, 13, I was bullied really badly, actually. And looking back now, I understand that's where some of my like mental health struggles started to appear. And I didn't know, you're a kid. And the idea of going to therapy was like, ooh, like that's for crazy people, that was the stigma. That was the belief, right? Like we thought like, and even that language, that's for crazy people. Like you wouldn't say that now. That's kind of harsh and mean. So like the idea of going to therapy, of talking about mental health was very different. Even, 20 years ago, let alone like 50 years ago. Um, back in the day, as we say, but like decades ago, we would send people away to asylums and to these like live-in facilities for things that nowadays we can treat with therapy and medication and yada yada. So like we've come a long way, but I think that is really in part due to things like having a mental health awareness month where, excuse me, where we can actually continue to shed light on these struggles because they're very real. They're very common. Actually, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, 1 in 5 people in the United States have a mental health condition. Like they qualify for a mental health condition. That's 57.8 million people 18 and up. That's like almost a quarter of the population of us, like legitimately have some type of mental illness. So, not only is it important to talk about for people who maybe don't have a mental health issue, but for those of us who are dealing with one, it's such a relief to have that space to talk about it and not feel like you're being judged or shunned or treated like you're less than or that you're weak or something like that. So you'll see like trending this month. One of the hashtags that I really like is are we still doing hashtags? I don't know what's popular on social media anymore, but hashtag break the stigma is a good one. And I think that to me is the biggest takeaway personally is, again, breaking the stigma of mental illness. If people felt more comfortable talking about their mental health struggles, then I think they would feel more comfortable getting help and asking for help. The more we break that stigma, and this is something like, I write about and that my writing team covers on some of the stuff that we have on addictionhelp.com is, for a lot of communities, because mental health is such a stigma still, it's seen as this like, you need to be like the machismo or stoic sense, like those qualities are held in a very high regard in a lot of different cultures and faith backgrounds, etc. And so because of that, a lot of people don't feel comfortable asking for help for addiction or substance abuse or depression as it like kind of ties in, because those two things do tie in quite a bit, which I'm going to get into that in a second. But really, just a couple more like facts that I wanted to drop down for you guys. So cool. So mental health or mental health conditions are more prevalent in women than men. So 27% versus 18%. Again, like with all statistics, you kind of have to look at, like it's kind of what I was just talking about. These are going to be reported, right? Like, so it's interesting to me that there are more women than men, 27% to 18% reporting mental health conditions. But when we look at society as a whole, at least here in the United States, right, like I was just saying, as a community, men in general are held to the standard of like, oh, don't cry, you're like a girl, or this association that you have to be macho, men don't cry, toughen up, man up. So looking at that, I think it's very interesting to consider if those statistics are 100% accurate. Would it be a higher number than 18% for men if it was like more common to talk about, right? So food for thought. Another interesting statistic that ties into kind of what I wanted to talk about for myself personally is that almost 50% of individuals who have substance use disorder, so that's full on addiction, not just somebody that's, probably doing things like experimenting or abusing or whatever, full on substance use disorder, 50% of them also meet the criteria for a mental health condition. That's a lot of people. And like this kind of segues into what I want to talk about, where it's about grief as a mental health condition, because, it's a tale as old as time, right? Like we hear, oh, so and so lost their mom, or, in my case, my grandmother, and, somebody very, very special to you, and a death hit somebody hard, tale as old as time, though they couldn't cope, they drank. That's such a common one. And it's almost a trope at this point, but there's a reason why that's so common. But first, let's cover grief as a mental health concern, because as a society, and this is kind of an aside, but I personally think we don't talk about deaths and grief as much as we should. So let's talk about it. Grief essentially relates to mental health because of the health concerns that can actually come up as a result of grief. So some of the most commonly cited mental health concerns that happen when somebody is grieving are anxiety, depression, insomnia, decreased appetite, mood swings, and that seems kind of like common, right? Like maybe sort of obvious. Like, yeah, of course, you're going to have trouble with those things, but they come in waves. They come and go. For those of you who are listening, who have been through the grief, like grief sucks, right? Death sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It sucks. But I feel like, at least for me, every grieving period has been very unique, and it always hurts. But there's, for some of us, I think there is the grief that when we lose somebody significant and profound, it just changes you as a person. It changes the way you look at the world. It changes, like, colors are different now. I know that sounds kind of a little nuts, but if you get it, you get it, and if you don't get it yet, I'm glad for you. So actually, that kind of brings me to my second point. So there's actually two types of grief. And I just found this out recently. I reconnected with an old therapist of mine, funny enough, kind of unrelated to all of this, but I adore her. I saw her like 10 years ago. She's the one that got me to give Lexapro a try. So for all my Lexapro fam out there, I see you. Changed my life and saved my life, but that's a whole other story. I just happened to reconnect with her, and we were talking about, a few different things. So most people, when they experience grief, they're experiencing acute grief, and that can last anywhere from 6 to 12 months. And that's considered normal. That's, loved one dies, and grief, by the way, is not just related to death. It is, you can actually go through the full grief process for job loss, losing a pet, relationships coming to an end, both friendship and romantic. So there are lots of ways in which we can grieve. But for what it's worth, we're talking about death grief today specifically. And, so acute grief is what most people experience. However, there is something called persistent or complex grief. And that's where it lasts for more than 12 months. And it really, really brings forth those mental health concerns, like I mentioned earlier, like the anxiety and the depression, insomnia. It just kind of changes you. Complex grief is more common with tragic deaths. So like a suicide or a sudden, unexpected death. Kind of on the flip side, the long death, where somebody is ill for a long time and you kind of lose them in little bits here and there. It doesn't have to be. Complex grief can happen to anyone for any type of grief, but it is more common with those tragic deaths. And, according to a study published by the Psychiatric Times, although couldn't find who actually did the original study, 40% of people grieving meet the criteria for major depression 1 month after their loss. We're not talking about just like, there's two kinds, right? There's depression, like, oh, I'm down, I'm feeling depressed, right? Then there's major depression, and that's the actual condition where it is like an ongoing, more lengthy sort of a process, right? So that's 40% of people grieving. qualify for that a month after their loss. That's a lot. It's a lot of half of people are dealing with basically medical depression. 24% of those people still meet the criteria after 2 months. So that really just shows, you know, like grief is hard. It's really hard. And so another study, actually, I happened to find that I wanted to mention while researching for this. And interestingly, this study was done right before the pandemic. So you can imagine how that has shaped the numbers now, right? But the pre-pandemic study done in the summer of 2019 showed that 57%, so over half of American adults, are grieving the loss of someone close to them within the last 3 years. So more than half of Americans self-reported, yes, I'm grieving losing someone within the last 3 years. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of grief. And so how does this all tie into grief and addiction and me personally? So let's get into that. Okay, so we talked a little bit about me and my brain. I have generalized anxiety disorder. I do also struggle with depression, which is a symptom of generalized anxiety disorder. And then I was also recently diagnosed with ADHD. So sometimes anxiety and depression can kind of flow with that. I do take Lexapro. Medication is not for everybody. And if it is for some people, and there's no shame in taking your meds. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think there is still sometimes a little bit of a stigma about that. So I see you. Jess supports you. So I'm 37 now, and I was trying to think, honestly, it's been long enough that I've kind of forgotten the year, which I guess is a good thing, but I do have one suicide attempt under my belt. It's very minor, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point on the podcast, but that's not what we're really here to discuss today. But I'm still here, so hooray, obviously it didn't work. So that's kind of like a very, in a nutshell, version of my mental health history, right? I've been in and out of therapy. I go when I feel I need it. And then, the goal of therapy is to not need it anymore, right? So, you quit therapy eventually. Not currently in therapy. And actually in a good place compared to what I'm about to start talking about. So I don't want anyone to worry, okay? So my grandmama, is and was my favorite person on the planet. Okay, it's like, this is no offense to my parents or my husband or my sister or a bunch of other people that are absolutely beloved to me. No one compared, right? She is just the epitome of kindness and perfection. Just I've worshipped her, right? And so when she was diagnosed with cancer in 2017, I thought, this won't be what takes her out. Like, the woman was so healthy, very big on like eating properly and nutritiously, exercise. She and my granddad actually loved golfing, and they never took a golf cart. Like, they walked the whole thing. They were just in fantastic shape. We actually traveled with them a couple of times, and like as kids, when my sister and I would struggle to keep up with them because they were in such great shape. So I thought, like, cancer, whatever. She also started radiation right away and was going to the gym at the same time. Like, this woman was a queen. I'm telling you, so tough. So, no way is it going to take her out, right? Well, it did. And it did it slowly and mercilessly. And I think that, important to mention. And for those of you who are listening who lost someone to cancer or to some long illness, like, you get it, right? Like, you don't just lose them when they die. You lose them over and over again in the little pieces, right? Like, when you get the radiation didn't work, you lose them a little bit there. And the surgery that, ended up causing some additional issues for her, and watching them struggle and fade. I mean, it's devastating. And so in 2020, of all years, right? January 1st, she died. And I remember thinking to myself, like, it didn't hit me at first. And then when it hit me, it hit me. And I still vividly remember like lying on my bed crying and this absolute, like a physical pain, like, right. Like we've been through breakups and, we're humans, right? Like grief and sorrow, like that physically hurts us. But I'm telling you, I've never felt anything as painful as that ever. And I dreaded this moment since I was a little girl. Like once I figured out what death was and it occurred to me like, oh, my grandparents are older than, like my parents and other people, like I'm going to lose them someday, to the point that I didn't even know how old she was. Like I would find out and then I would intentionally forget because like I just didn't want to. It's probably not a great looking at that now, that's probably not a great way to process things, but I mean, that's the reality, right? So anyway, she died. I was miserable. It was January of 2020, and that was the worst year of my life. And I'm sure it was actually for a lot of people, funny enough, but for a different reason, right? Like a lot of people talk about, March of that year, the world really ended. And for me, it ended sooner than that. It really came apart in January. So how does this relate to addiction and substance abuse? I promise I'm getting there. So at first, like I mentioned earlier, like it just changed what I thought of the world. And when we were talking to my husband, like I was so depressed and depleted, and I knew I probably need therapy, but I don't want it. And that was significant for me because I love therapy. I think it's fantastic. I wish everyone could afford and could feel comfortable doing therapy at least in their lives. But I thought to myself, I don't even want to get better because I just don't care. Everything that I thought I knew about the world and about balance and about good versus evil and overcome, like everything changed the day she died. And that's a lot to grapple with. And I, like many people, also started drinking a lot during the pandemic. Now, I've always been like a pretty social drinker. Didn't really bring it home much, but like, would go out a couple nights a week sometimes, or, events with friends, like, oh, we'll meet at the bar. So I was already like kind of a drinker, but then the world stopped in March and it just kind of became a thing for a lot of people. I actually was talking to my doctor about this somewhat recently. And yeah, like a lot of people, for whatever reason, started drinking during the pandemic. And I was one of them. And it turned into every single night I was drinking at least a 6-pack, sometimes two. And I was drinking IPAs. So for those of you who are not like beer aficionados, an IPA is, oops, I just realized I probably crackled my mic. Sorry for your ears. An IPA is a higher alcohol percentage. The one, I even wrote it down. Where did I write it? The one I drank was 8.2%. So I think for context, like a Miller Lite or a Bud Light is like half that. So I was having 6 of those a night. I gained 60 pounds. I was hungover constantly. I had heartburn, like chronically, and that was never something I dealt with before that. And it didn't start out that way, but it started out as like, screw it. Like, who cares? Nothing matters. The world, everything is made up and fake. Nothing matters anyway, right? And it was this weird, sort of jokingly nihilistic, the world's on fire, everything's shut down, my grandmother's dead, so like, who cares? And it turned into like I said, a full year to the point that every day, my husband, bless him, who I kind of dragged down with me, really, would go to the corner store, pick up 2 6-packs, sometimes 3, and we would split that. They would be gone by the end of the night, every single night. And sometimes for funsies, we would also get a thing of whiskey and have a couple of shots, and that would last, a few days. So that's a lot of drinking, right? That's a lot of drinking. And, interestingly too, I also was having weird anxiety spikes, um, deep depression, but like for a couple days, and then I'd come back out of it. And, I mentioned earlier, I take Lexapro. You're not supposed to drink, or you're supposed to be very careful with drinking when you're on Lexapro because it affects how the medication interacts with your brain, how you absorb it. You can give yourself serotonin, like all kinds of things, right? Um, so for me, like looking back, I absolutely qualified for alcohol use disorder, you know. So why did I stop, right? Because I don't drink anymore, rarely. Um, it was a combination of things for me. Seeing a few pictures and seeing how big I had gotten. Now, I am not here to body shame anyone. Uh, Size is not important. For me personally, the weight that I had added came onto me, or basically I added it onto my body during a really dark time. And for me, it was like wearing my grief on my outside. I felt physically uncomfortable. And so that was kind of the first, like, maybe this is not such a good habit after all. Like maybe something does matter after all. Um, I did not know what I know now about the safety of quitting alcohol when you're drinking regularly. You got to be so careful. It is one of the only withdrawals, that and benzos, so like Xanax and stuff, one of the only withdrawals that can actually kill you. So, if you're listening to this and you're like, man, this is the kick in the butt I needed to to stop drinking, talk to your doctor, which is what I should have done, just to be safe, because you can die from withdrawals. I was very lucky. I did not. I ended up being okay. Um, and if, like, and I think it was just a combination of just my physical not matching anymore, and just time and healing. It's like with any grief. I had already been grieving previously the loss of my cousin in 2017. He did die by suicide, and so that sort of complex grief with this additional grief, I think I gave up. And it's I'm not sure that I would call myself an addict, because I don't know that that's fair. I think that there is a distinct difference. And this isn't me trying to, shirk responsibility or say that in any way try to make myself seem like better than anyone or anything like that. So I just want to be clear. But there is a distinct difference for when people struggle with the never enough feeling. I've heard different recovering addicts talk about where it's just never enough. You can't leave an empty glass, or it's any substance, right, that makes them feel good, that they just can't stop. I've had a much easier time quitting once I decide to quit than I think others have who have dealt with actual like substance use disorder. I was definitely dependent on alcohol for sure. My body had become very used to it, and it greatly affected me. But I think I'm fortunate in that, like, nowadays I'm not sober. I'm mostly sober, but every once in a while, like, I went on a trip with a friend. We got Thai. She'd never had sake before. It had been raining all day, and so we had like a nice warm sake together, and it was like an experience, and that was it. Didn't trigger anything, and that's not the same for everyone. So I recognize that as well. But like, this is something we don't talk about, to kind of go back to the mental health awareness and all that, and why I'm sharing this to begin with. Because, there's a lot of shame and a lot of feelings of failure. And in a lot of ways, yeah, I did fail, right? Like, that doesn't make me a horrible person. That doesn't make me a failure of a human being, but I definitely messed up. That was not a good way or a healthy way to manage my grief. And, I'm really fortunate that it only lasted probably about a year at most. And, I've had other issues over the years with substance abuse, which, we'll get into, I'm sure, another time on the podcast. But I'm very grateful that I was able to come out of that largely unscathed. So yeah, I guess, what I would say, looking back on it now, kind of what I've learned, et cetera, and to kind of wrap this up for you guys. Grief sucks. Grief is really hard. But you don't have to do it alone. And I think it's okay to mourn and grieve and throw yourself a pity party. Just don't bring booze. Really, like, throw yourself a pity party. Just don't unpack your bag. There's an expression out there, and I might be butchering it, but it's okay to just sit and stop and just be in your feelings. Just don't unpack. Don't stay there. Don't plan to stay there. You're just passing through. But I think the only thing I would change during that whole period was the drinking. But I think the rest I did pretty okay. I talked to people. I, didn't try to like sunshine, happiness my way out of it. Like, if I felt bad, I felt bad. Again, grief sucks. Death sucks. You're going to have hard days. I still have hard days. I still cry about it sometimes. But it's so cliche, but it is so true. It does. I promise. Yeah. So if you're out there and you're listening and you're struggling with grief, or you're struggling with a substance, and I just want you to know, like, I don't know you, but I do care about you. I do. It sounds so lame, but I promise I do. Because, none of us, like, being a human is hard, and none of us are out here doing this alone. We shouldn't be, Like, I know what it's like to a degree where you get stuck in that cycle where, like, for me, I was drinking and then I felt like such a garbage person. Like, if somebody had told me it gets better, I'd be like, yeah, but I don't deserve it, and then you go in this loop of, like, you feel like you don't deserve it. And so you just stick with it. And like, there would be times that I would wake up the next morning over in hell, just miserable, and would think, oh, I'm dead tonight. And for some reason, I still would. It was like I intentionally was like hurting myself. And you hear that when people talk about addiction, but it doesn't make sense until you're there, right? And it is also true what they say. Like, you can't force anybody to get better. Nobody could have forced me, but I wanted it. And so I did. And so if you want it, you can bring into it. You absolutely can. So all of this to say, life's hard. Humaning is hard. But a lot of it's really good too. Truly, a lot of it's really good. And I'm happy to be here. I'm so stoked to be here. I still miss my grandmother every single day, but now I have an experience that I can use to relate to people who really need it. So, anywho, I don't want to get too sappy on you guys. I appreciate you all for listening. And I guess that's kind of it for today. As a reminder, if you liked what you heard today, please feel free to subscribe to our podcast wherever you're listening. If there's a subscription option, there probably is. YouTube, I know we're on Spotify. I think we're on Apple Music as well, which is pretty rad. Wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe. Also, leave a comment, ask questions. You can also reach out to me personally if you would like. My email address is jessica@addictionhelp.com, just like it sounds for the website. So my full name, not Jess, I do go by Jess, but for the email purposes, it's jessica@addictionhelp.com. Shoot me a question. Let me know what you thought of today's episode. If you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, I don't take complaints though. So yeah, but everything else, yes. All right, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I love you. I appreciate you. And I'll see you guys next time.